Final Fantasy franchise has a long history with 16 mainline entries and a bunch of spin-offs. Now, I have been a Final Fantasy fan since Final Fantasy VI, aka 3, and one of the games that I've never played up to this point was Final Fantasy XIV. And the reason I never played Final Fantasy XIV personally was because it was an MMO, and while I had played WoW in the past, to me, I was burnt out with the MMO style, and I never could desire or want to play 14. That is until Square Enix made the conscious decision to allow players to essentially solo the entire main quest line of the game. Because of this, I decided to take the plunge on word of some close friends of mine who have said to me in the past that Final Fantasy XIV's narrative is one of the best in the entire series. So with that in mind, I jumped in and I started playing Final Fantasy XIV. So this review is part 1 of the review that encompasses the base mainline entry of Final Fantasy XIV. The review entirely will be broken up into 5 parts, as the other 4 parts will cover the expansions that came after the base game. That being said, this game has obviously been released some time ago, and from a technological standpoint, the visuals of the game is unquestionably dated. Yes, they are getting an update or coming with the new expansion in 2024 Dawn Trail, but from a technological standpoint, the visuals are to be expected to be dated as I'm playing the game now in 2023. That being said, however, Square Enix's art style is timeless, and because of this, the game still looks fantastic as the characters, environments, the clothing, everything about the game is Final Fantasy at its core, and therefore, because the art is so good, the game still looks pretty, even though technologically it's behind. The presentation of the game is also amplified by the fact that, yes, you do have a great musical score. Final Fantasy is known for having good music, and 14 is no exception. The music in Final Fantasy 14 is great. Whether you're riding your mount through the world, or in combat, or just experiencing a cutscene, the music accompanies the game very well across the board and helps set the mood and ambiance for whatever scene that you are currently in. As for the gameplay, well, as you would expect, Final Fantasy XIV is an MMO, so you start at level 1 and you progress through, you unlock spells, and you go around, you fight baddies, you fight bosses, you collect loot, you get stronger, rinse and repeat until you complete the game's main story. Now, the one thing I do like about Final Fantasy XIV is how the developer Square Enix integrated solo play and how they made solo play possible. Oftentimes there are dungeons that you have to do, but when you select a dungeon for the main quest, you have a choice. You can either queue in the dungeon with an NPCs, or you can queue with other players. If you choose to do NPCs as I did, you will have no queue time, you'll jump in, and the game will actually augment your party based on who you picked. So considering that I was running a black mage, the game would give me a tank, it would also give me a healer, and the AI was sophisticated enough that I don't have to babysit them. Tanks will pull enemies towards them, healer will heal you, and you, as a DPS, could fulfill your role as a damage dealer without having to babysit the AI. The obviously best benefit to soloing a dungeon is, well, you get all the loot to yourself and you get to play at your own pace. However, obviously, the game is best experienced when you are playing with other players. That being said, it needs to be said that with the game's dungeon system, you can only solo dungeons in the main quest line. Any side dungeon you choose to do that is not part of the main quest line, you must do with other players, as there is no NPC option. So that is something to be aware of. As for the bosses for this game, the bosses themselves are great because they don't repeat, at least from my playthrough. I primarily did the main quest and class quests, and any and all dungeons in between that pertain to the main quest, and never was a boss duplicated. Every boss was unique, every boss had their own attacks, every boss had their own strategies. This was great because it helped keep boss battles unique, fresh, but at the same time keep them relatively challenging. And I say relatively because overall Final Fantasy XIV is not a difficult game to play in terms of raw difficulty. Unless you choose to do a hard dungeon or a hard raid, the game itself from a narrative main story perspective is not difficult at all. And if you are in an instance that is too difficult, upon death you would have the option to choose to play it on easy or very easy if it was too hard to begin with. So the game is very relaxed when it comes to allowing players to just get in, immerse themselves in the story and the game without having to challenge themselves too much. And that's up to you. So overall, in terms of accessibility, Final Fantasy XIV is pretty accessible, and the community is actually quite helpful. Lastly, the one thing I want to talk about is with the main story. Now, the main story, as much as I enjoyed it, is also fundamentally flawed, and is probably the biggest issue I had with the base game of Final Fantasy XIV. And the reason I say this is because the main story, the main overarching story is good, but it gets repetitive. So without spoiling anything, you as the player are to go around and free towns from the summons and collect crystals. Okay, great. The issue is that every new town or area you go to, before you can go after the summon of that area, you have to prove yourself to the city leader. And when you prove yourself to the city leader, they will give you a bunch of miscellaneous quests that are just fetch quests, which is go to point A, talk to somebody, complete it, come back. And this process requires lots and lots of fast traveling, and it gets annoying because sometimes the quest will tell you to talk to one person and then ask you to exit the room, teleport to another town, talk to a person, and then teleport back and report back to the original person. So once you've proven yourself, you then get pointed into the direction of, hey, this is where the summon is, this is what we need you to do, go and do it. When you go and do that part, the story moves forward. The main boss or the main enemy villain of this game is present throughout these scenes. The story moves along as it expands on the characters and shows you what's happening in the world. But this comes in between those sections. And once you clear an area, you kill the summon, and you move on, you rinse and repeat this process. New area, prove yourself to the leader, get pointed in the direction of the summon, go fight the summon, main story moves along, rinse and repeat. That is the loop of the story throughout the entirety of Final Fantasy XIV. And because of this, it is what makes the game feel like a slog. Because when you are pursuing a summon and the story's actually moving forward, where you get the cutscenes and you see the main villain, etc., that stuff is good. But the constant of proving yourself with miscellaneous quests to the leaders, that gets boring and repetitive relatively quickly, and it was the biggest issue I had with the base game of Final Fantasy XIV. It is why people told me before jumping in that, hey, the main base game can be a slog because of this, and I see why after having experienced it for myself. That being said, that was the only real flaw I had with Final Fantasy XIV's base game, was the repetitive nature of the story. Aside from this, the game was a blast to play. The learning curve wasn't too difficult. The game does a very good job of easing you along and teaching you the new mechanics as you go along. I played the majority of the base game solo, and it was a blast. I had a good time. And I highly personally recommend Final Fantasy XIV for Final Fantasy players. If you've never played Final Fantasy XIV, it's a great time to get into it, especially since Square Enix has a very generous free trial that gives you the entirety of the base game and the first expansion, a level cap up to level 70, and there's no time limit on how much you can play. So if you're unsure if you want to financially commit to the game, play the free trial, check it out, see if you like it, and if you choose to continue playing, make your purchase, and all your progress carries on. Overall, though, I recommend Final Fantasy XIV to any Final Fantasy fan, at least for the base game. I'm giving the base game of Final Fantasy XIV a 9 out of 10. This concludes the part 1 of my review of Final Fantasy XIV. Look for part 2, which is covering Heavensward in the near future. This is Veteran Gamer, and I hope to see you guys next time.